The first warnings didn't come from men, they came from the mountain itself, whispered through branches, echoed through canyons, and carried on a strange, brittle wind that made even seasoned trappers glance upward as though something ancient had awakened. In the autumn of 1886, the Wind River Range looked familiar, but it felt wrong. The cold arrived early, sliding down the slopes long before snow ever touched the ground. Birds that normally lingered well into November vanished from the sky in a single week. Horses grew coats so thick you could bury your fingers in them and never touch skin. And the beaver, the most reliable of nature's messengers, began building lodges as though they were preparing for a siege instead of a season. Old mountain men muttered quietly to each other, using words like bad and hard, and then, reluctantly, biblical. Every sign pointed toward a winter no one was prepared for, except one man, high above Fremont Creek, beneath a limestone overhang carved by centuries of wind. A solitary trapper named Hugh McKenzie watched the animals flee the high country and made a choice that baffled everyone who passed by. While other men packed their gear and hurried toward lower elevations, Mackenzie stayed behind. And instead of building a cabin in the valley or joining winter camps near Fort Bridger, he began hauling stones, day after day, load after load, building something that looked less like a shelter and more like a boundary between life and death. Most men believed winter could be survived with fire, luck, and the thick walls of a good log cabin. Mackenzie believed winter was survived by understanding its intentions long before it arrived, and he had read the signs better than anyone. As the first thin snow fell across the valley, riders paused on the trail, staring at him with confusion. One man shouted up, asking if he'd lost his senses building with stone when timber lay thick down the slope. Mackenzie barely looked up. Something in the air had convinced him that this winter was not just going to test a man's gear, it was going to test his judgment. He had seen the color of the sky, felt the weight in the wind, watched the old rhythms of the land break one by one. And from the mouth of that alcove, he could feel the mountains bracing for something they hadn't unleashed in decades. So he kept placing stone after stone, fitting each one with careful precision, as though he were racing a deadline only he could hear. And he was right, because the storms that were coming would not just challenge a man's endurance, they would challenge his very understanding of cold itself. He wasn't reckless or fearless or chasing some stubborn fantasy of invincibility. Hugh McKenzie stayed because he had spent 25 years listening to the mountains more closely than most men listen to other people. And when the land spoke, he trusted it. Born in the Scottish Highlands, he grew up around stone. Cottages built from slabs, fitted so tightly you could hardly slip a knife between them. By 19, he'd crossed the Atlantic, worked railroads, swung axes, hauled ties, and watched men freeze in early blizzards because they underestimated what cold could do. When he finally stepped into the fur trade, he found a world where survival wasn't taught. It was earned. Near death taught him the rest. In 1878, he was caught in a high-elevation storm that appeared out of a clear sky, a white roar that swallowed the world in minutes. He lost 3 toes to frostbite. A Shoshone healer saved his life, cut away the dead flesh, and told him a truth he never forgot. If you fight winter, it kills you. If you listen, it lets you live. From that moment forward, Mackenzie watched winter the way a sailor watches the sea. He memorized the way clouds thickened before a blizzard. He studied how elk migrated early when harsh cold approached. He could read currents of wind by the way snow blew across a ridge. So when the signs of 1886 appeared, frantic beavers, thick-coated horses, the early silence in the woods, he didn't call them interesting. He called them warnings. And warnings demanded action. To Mackenzie, a log cabin was not enough. Wood was light, it burned, and it let cold seep through in ways you couldn't control. Stone, on the other hand, stored heat. Stone made a barrier that winter had to fight its way through. The limestone alcove he found was perfect, south-facing, protected from the wind, and old enough to have sheltered others long before him. But a cave alone wouldn't save a man. Openings invited cold, like a funnel draws water. He needed something better, something that would turn that natural alcove into a fortress. So he began building with purpose, shaping every stone with the care of a craftsman. He mixed mortar from clay, sand, ash, and animal fat, a technique taught long ago by an older trapper. The fat kept the mixture flexible, the ash hardened it, and the clay bound it. It wasn't just functional, it was intelligent engineering. As the wall rose, passing riders slowed their horses and called out warnings. They told him he was wasting time. They told him a cabin would serve him better. But he knew what he was building and why. Cold could slip through wood. It could not slip through 3 feet of rock. What he didn't tell them was the rest. He didn't trust the valleys. He didn't trust cabins crowded near other men. Crowds complicated survival. Mistakes multiplied. But the mountain? Alone, he knew exactly what to expect from it. And winter was about to reveal just how right he'd been, in ways even he had not imagined. Before the snow sealed the high country, Mackenzie worked like a man, racing the last hour of sunlight. Every choice he made in that alcove was deliberate, not for comfort, not for pride, but for survival. During a winter he suspected would break records, and men alike, the stones he hauled came from a talus slope far below the cliff, shaped by centuries of wind and water. He selected each one for how it locked against its neighbor. Flat-sided pieces for corners, heavy slabs for the base, sandstone and granite stacked so tightly that, once mortared, the wall behaved like a single organism instead of a pile of rocks. He built it 3 feet thick at the bottom, tapering slightly towards the top. The wall stood 8 feet high, but he left a narrow gap between the upper stones and the limestone ceiling, a built-in chimney that would pull smoke upward while letting fresh air enter near the ground. Heat would reflect off the plastered interior and pool in the cave's belly like water behind a dam. The entrance was only 18 inches wide, 6 feet tall, and angled away from the punishing northwest winds. Most trappers would have laughed at such a narrow doorway. Mackenzie saw it as a gift. Heat would have far fewer paths to escape. Inside, he raised a stone sleeping platform, packed it with dried grass under his furs, and dug a small pit for vegetables. Hooks in the ceiling held bags of dried meat. The back wall was stacked with firewood, arranged with such precision it resembled the ribs of a ship. He wasn't just building a shelter, he was building a calculating machine, one designed to trap heat, slow the cold, and stretch his supplies into the unthinkable. His mortar was the heart of it, clay to bind, sand to prevent cracking, ash for strength, and animal fat for flexibility against freeze and thaw. Many men could stack stones. Few knew how to make them endure a mountain winter. As he worked, light storms brushed the ridges, scattering early snow across the alcove. Riders on the trail below shook their heads, calling up warnings, telling him he was building a tomb. Mackenzie didn't argue. You couldn't convince men who believed they were right. You could only outlast them. When the wall finally sealed the alcove, he tested the airflow. Smoke curled upward exactly as he had hoped. The stone warmed slowly, but steadily. Once heated, it refused to give up its warmth. Stone remembered. Outside, animals hurried down valley, an exodus that confirmed every warning he'd felt in the wind. Winter was coming with a vengeance, and he had built a fortress worthy of it. Before the storms arrived, he stocked the shelves: jerky, pemmican, dried berries, roots from the Shoshone healer who once saved him. He sharpened his tools, repaired his moccasins, and cleaned his rifle. Then he stepped inside the stone structure, closed the narrow entrance behind him, and let the mountain air settle into silence. As you listen to this story, take a moment to reflect on the kind of preparation that changes outcomes. If you value deep human stories of resilience, consider joining us here on Frontier Tales of America. Your support helps bring forgotten history back to life. The first real storm was only days away, and everything he had built was about to face its trial by ice. The first storm didn't roar in with fury. It crept, A thin veil of freezing rain coated the cliffs, turning every surface into glass. Mackenzie woke to the tap of ice forming overhead, a sound sharp enough to echo through the alcove. The temperature slid downward, first to the teens, then into single digits, and finally into numbers that told him the mountain was only clearing its throat. Through the narrow entrance, he watched the storm thicken. Snow fell in heavy, wet sheets, clinging to branches, weighing down pine boughs until they bent toward the earth. The cold pressed against the stone wall like a living thing testing the strength of his work. Inside, he tended his fire and took inventory. Nothing was wasted in winter. Every tool, every scrap of dried meat, every coil of rope, every patch of leather represented hours of survival. He sharpened blades to pass the time. Clean tools did not fail at the worst moment. Sharp knives prevented accidents. Clean rifles stayed reliable when moisture turned to ice. When the sky cleared 3 days later, the world outside looked unfamiliar. White drifts filled every fold of the land. Creek edges were armored in ice. Mackenzie walked the short path to his water source and chipped through several inches of frozen crust. It wasn't beauty he saw. It was a warning. Then came the second storm. It didn't arrive quietly. It descended like a collapsing sky, shredding visibility within minutes and dragging temperatures down with it. Wind poured through the valley, snapping branches like brittle twigs. Snow hammered the ridge with a force that hissed against the cliff. Inside the stone alcove, Mackenzie listened. Listening was intelligence here. Wind patterns told him more than any instrument. He sensed how the storm curled around the cliffs, how the valley funneled gusts upward, how pressure dropped before each shift in temperature. Still, he stayed calm. His shelter performed as he intended. The stone wall blocked the wind. The fire pit drew smoke upward. Heat reflected from the plastered interior. Inside, the temperature held around 50 degrees, almost comfortable. His winter routine took shape. At dawn, he stirred the fire, melted snow for water, and ate porridge with strips of dried meat. If the wind slowed, he stepped outside to maintain his path to the woodpile and water. Every movement was deliberate. Sweat was dangerous. Even a damp shirt could freeze into a layer of ice. Inside, he practiced slow movements he had learned decades earlier. Motion and breath that kept joints warm and muscles working. Through December, storms stacked one after another, each worse than the last. Snowbanks rose. The creek slowed. Animals vanished. Then one morning, he awoke to frost suspended in the air inside the shelter. His breath crystallized before it reached the ground. It meant the cold outside had reached a level that could kill a man in minutes, and the worst of it was still on the way. The morning it began, the air inside Mackenzie's shelter felt thin and brittle, as though even warmth had frozen overnight. His breath crystallized the instant it left his mouth, falling like tiny shards onto the stone floor. That was the first sign. The second was silence. Not the quiet of dawn, but the stillness that settles before something immense arrives. He checked the thermometer near his sleeping platform, 8 degrees below zero. Inside, that meant the outside world had fallen into temperatures so deep they bordered on the unthinkable. Layered in furs and wool, he crawled through his snow tunnel. The moment he emerged, the cold hit him like a blow. His eyelashes froze together when he blinked. Moisture in his nose turned instantly to ice. Even the air tasted metallic, a sign the cold was pulling moisture straight from his lungs. He lasted only minutes outside, long enough to read the sky, feel the pressure dropping, and understand that this wasn't a storm. It was a reckoning. Back inside, he prepared for the one thing his wall had not yet faced: cold, so relentless it could outlast even his deep stores of firewood. He pulled every remaining piece inside, stacked them until the alcove felt smaller. He melted snow, stuffed dried moss into gaps he hadn't noticed, gathered food within arm's reach. Then the storm arrived. It did not roar. It struck. Wind slammed against the cliff hard enough to make the stone vibrate. Powder-fine snow blasted through the chimney gap and scattered across the floor like sand. Outside, The temperature plunged into a range no human could survive uncovered. The wind screamed with a pitch that vibrated through bone. Inside, the temperature sank to 12 below zero, even with the fire burning fiercely. Mackenzie fed the flames constantly. The heat warmed the stone. The stone slowly gave warmth back. Even the thermal mass struggled against the cold, pressing in from every direction. He rationed wood by instinct, adding more when the fire dipped, letting it settle when the walls radiated enough heat to carry the next hour. Snow collected in the far corner of the alcove, forming a silver-blue drift. He allowed it to remain. A layer of snow, oddly enough, insulated better than bare stone. The noise was relentless. For 72 hours, he lived inside an unbroken roar, a sound so primal, it felt like it came from the bones of the earth. He slept in short bursts, waking often to feed the fire or to reassure himself that the wall still held. Every time he checked, it stood unmoved. No cracks, no sweat from frost. The plaster still reflected heat. When the storm finally broke, the silence that followed felt unreal. Inside, the temperature was still 28 below zero, which meant the outside had plunged far deeper, into a realm few instruments could measure. He did not rush to dig out. He waited, warmed his joints, drank water, and moved with patience. Rushing meant sweat. Sweat meant hours. Later, he carved his way out. The world he emerged into was unrecognizable. Hills and valleys erased beneath towering drifts, trees buried to their crowns, silence stretching across the land. Not a track, not a bird, nothing moved. And January was far from over. Winter still held weeks of fury in reserve. When the worst of January finally eased, the cold did not vanish. It simply softened into something a man could endure. For the first time in days, Mackenzie woke without the searing sting of frozen air scraping his lungs. The fire still glowed faintly. The walls still radiated what heat they could. And in the fragile silence that followed the storm, he sensed it was time to step outside. He dressed slowly and deliberately, checking each layer for even the smallest trace of dampness. Winter punished haste. Then he crawled through the tunnel he'd carved, pushing aside a crust of ice until open air touched his face, thin and brittle. The world outside had been transformed. Snow lay 15 to 18 feet deep, swallowing the land so completely that landmarks he'd known for 25 years were gone. Ridges smoothed over, valleys filled to the brim, trees buried so deeply that only their top branches reached the surface. The mountains had traded their familiar form for an endless, rolling expanse of white. Mackenzie began surveying his surroundings with quiet calculation. He tested each step on the hardened crust, moving slowly to avoid breaking through into the powder beneath. In some places, he had to carve his way downward just to move forward. 2 miles downstream, he encountered the first evidence of winter's toll. A bull elk stood frozen in a posture of life, preserved so perfectly it looked carved from ice. Its ribs pressed against its hide, its eyes open, its stance unchanged from its final moment. The cold had claimed it instantly, then kept it intact. Farther down the slope, clusters of deer and mountain sheep lay together in death, bodies pressed close, as though trying to share warmth that never came. Predator trails had vanished. Even scavengers had either fled or perished. As February turned slowly toward March, brief periods of sunlight brought clarity to the landscape. The snow sparkled like crushed glass. These pauses allowed Mackenzie to gather more wood, repair his tunnels, and reclaim pieces of himself after the long stretch of isolation. Movement restored his mental balance. Sunlight restored his sense of time. He knew stillness too long could break a man just as surely as cold. On one clear day, he reached the collapsed cabin of another trapper 5 miles down valley. The roof had been crushed by the weight of snow. He dug for an hour, but found no sign of the man. Whether he had escaped or lay buried too deep to find, winter revealed nothing. By April, the worst had finally passed. Snow settled, creeks thinned, and the sky softened. Birds returned cautiously, as though unsure whether the mountains were finished testing them. Mackenzie took stock of what he had endured. He hadn't conquered the winter. He had survived it because he had been ready when others were not. And that understanding settled into him as firmly as the cold once had. When Hugh McKenzie walked into Fort Bridger in late April, thinner but steady on his feet, the men inside stared as though a ghost had stepped across the threshold. Word had spread weeks earlier that anyone who stayed in the high country was gone, claimed by storms, buried in drifts, frozen in silence like the animals he had found. But Mackenzie was alive. He told them about the stone wall, its thickness, its mortar, the way the alcove shielded the wind. Many listened politely. Some dismissed it. But a few, the veterans who understood the cruelty of mountain winters, nodded with quiet respect. To them, it was obvious. Survival wasn't luck. Survival was preparation. That summer, Mackenzie returned to the alcove. He found the shelter exactly as he had left it. Every stone in place. No cracks in the mortar. No moisture inside. It was as solid as the day he built it. He improved it further, adding an interior wall, better drainage, and stronger storage. Over the next 3 winters, it protected him again and again, until age and injury finally pulled him down to gentler ground. But the shelter stayed. Trappers called it Mackenzie's Fort. Shoshone families used it in harsh seasons. Rangers sheltered there. Surveyors camped beneath its limestone ceiling and wrote about its craftsmanship with amazement. More than a century later, the structure still stands. 3 feet of stone, clay, sand, ash, and animal fat. A limestone roof older than memory. A design so simple and strong that even modern engineers study it. But its real legacy isn't the wall. It's the wisdom behind it. Mackenzie survived because he listened to nature when others ignored it. He prepared when others laughed. He trusted knowledge earned through hardship more than confidence earned through routine. That wisdom still matters today, whether building a refuge, facing a difficult season, or simply navigating the unknown. If stories like Mackenzie's remind you of the strength in preparation and the quiet courage of ordinary people, consider joining us on the Winds of Thought. Your support helps keep these lessons alive. The walls he built still stand in the high country, silent, steadfast, waiting. A reminder that nature tests us, preparation protects us, and sometimes 3 feet of carefully placed stone can outlast the fiercest storms history can deliver.